In today's podcast, we're going to do a deep dive into oceans and fisheries with two experts, one from academia and one from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, or FAO. We'll discuss research and strategies to build climate resilience with respect to seafood resource management and make the connection to fishing and community-sustaining livelihoods, food security challenges, and human migration. Welcome to the Leading Voices in Food podcast series. I'm Norbert Wilson, Professor of Public Policy at the Sanford School of Public Policy at Duke University and the Director of the World Food Policy Center. It is my great pleasure to also welcome my co-host for today, Kerilyn Schewel, Co-Director of the Duke Program on Climate, Resilience, and Mobility. Kerilyn's research focuses on the root causes of migration and the relationship between climate change, development, and migration triggers. Kerilyn.
Thanks, Norbert. I'm looking forward to talking with our guests and exploring how partnerships between academia and agencies like the FAO can help achieve global sustainable development goals. So now let me introduce development economist Nicole Franz. She's the Equitable Livelihoods Team Leader at the FAO's Fisheries and Aquaculture Division. And my colleague here at Duke, John Virdin, Director of the Ocean Policy Program within the Duke University Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability. Nicole and John, thanks so much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
So, Nicole, let's begin with you. Why is your work at the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization focused on small-scale fisheries and fishing communities? And could you share with us, how are they different from fisheries more broadly? What's unique about them and their role in food production?
Let me start by this latter question. And I think the first thing is to clarify actually what are small-scale fisheries, no? Because sometimes if you think about small-scale fisheries, what most people will have in mind is probably that a man in a small boat fishing. But in reality, it's a sector that is much more diverse. There are, for example, women in Tunisia that are collecting clams by foot, no? They're foot fishers. Or we have examples from small-scale fisheries that are fishing boats in Norway, which are comparably small. But if you compare them, for example, with how small-scale fishing looks in a place like Mozambique, it's a very different scale. But all of that, however, is comprised in what we understand as small-scale fisheries. It is also important to understand that when we talk about small-scale fisheries in FAO, we don't only limit it to what is happening in the water, the harvesting part, but we also include what happens once the fish is out of the water. So once it's processed then, and when it's traded. So it's a whole supply chain that is connected to that small-scale fisheries production that we understand as being small-scale fisheries. And with Duke University, with John, who was present here, and other colleagues from World Fish, we did a global study where we tried to estimate the global contributions of small-scale fisheries to sustainable development. And what we found was that at least 40% of the global catch is actually coming from inland and marine small-scale fisheries. And that's enormous. That's a huge amount. More important almost is that 90% of all of the people that are employed in capture fisheries are in small-scale fisheries. And that is the human dimension of it. And that's why the community dimension is so important for the work, because it is that big amount of people, 61 million people that are employed in the value chains. And in addition to that, we estimated that there are about 53 million people that are actually engaging in small-scale fisheries for subsistence. So if we consider those people that are employed in small-scale fisheries plus those that are engaging for subsistence and all of their household members, we're actually talking about close to 500 million people that depend at least partially on small-scale fisheries for their livelihoods. We also looked at the economic dimensions of small-scale fisheries, and we found that the value from the first sale of small-scale fishery products amounts to $77 billion. So these numbers are important. They show the importance of small-scale fisheries in terms of their production, but also in terms of the livelihood dimension, in terms of the economic value that they generate. And last but not least, we also looked at the nutritional value from small-scale fisheries, and we estimated that the catch from small-scale fisheries would be able to supply almost 1 billion women globally. That's 50% of the recommended omega-3 fatty acid intake. So I think with all of these numbers, hopefully I can convey why the focus on small-scale fishes in the context of food security and poverty eradication in particular is of fundamental importance.
Thanks, Nicole. That's really helpful to get kind of global picture. If I could follow up to ask, what regions of the world are small-scale fisheries more common, or do economies rely on them? And in what regions do you see them disappearing? Are they common in countries like the US, for example?
But they're certainly more common in what is often considered as a global south. In Asia in particular, we encountered the largest total numbers, absolute numbers, in terms of people involved, in terms of production, but also in Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, in the Pacific, obviously, they play a crucial role. They are more and more disappearing in the US, for example. In Europe, we see that it is a livelihood that is no longer very common. And one of the features we see there that it's an aging sector, it's a shrinking sector for a number of reasons. But they still define the characteristic of certain areas where they really are part of the identity and of the local culture, even in the US or in many, many places in Europe.
Nicole, this is really fascinating. And so thank you for sharing this broad overview of what's happening and who are small scale fishers. What are some of the common challenges that these small scale fishers and fisheries face? And what is FAO's response to those challenges?
Well, where to start? There are so many challenges. I think one fundamental challenge that is common across all regions is securing access to fishing grounds, but not only to fishing grounds, also to the coastal areas where they land the boats, where they process the fish, where the fishing villages and communities are located. In many areas around the world, we see expansion of tourism, expansion of urban areas and coastal areas, the increase of other industries that are competing for the space, no? And that are often stronger, economically more visible than small-scale fisheries. So the competition over space in those areas is quite an issue. But there are also many challenges that are more outside of the fishing activity directly. For example, often small-scale fishing communities lack access to services, be it basic services such as education or health services, social protection. And in many cases, women are particularly disadvantaged in relation to access to these services. For example, women that are involved in harvesting or in processing of fish in small-scale fisheries, they often do not know where to leave their children while they are at work, because there's no childcare facility in many of these villages. And there are 45 million women that are engaged in small-scale fisheries around the world. Another set of challenges relates to the value chains and the markets. Often there's limited infrastructure to connect to markets. There's processing and storage facility that are not adequate to bring the product to the market in a state that allows to then fetch good prices and to benefit from the value chain. Often small-scale fishers and fish workers are also not well organized, so they become more subject to power imbalances along the value chain, where they have to be price takers. No, they have to accept what is offered, and that also relates often to a lack of transparency in relation to market information. And of course, then we have another set of challenges that are coming from climate change, that are becoming more and more important, and from other types of disasters also. One thing that brings together all of these challenges or makes them worse is often the lack of representative structures and also institutional structures that allow for participation in relevant decision-making or management processes, so that small-scale fishers and fish workers don't even have an opportunity to flag their needs or to propose solutions. So FAO has facilitated a process to develop voluntary guidelines for securing sustainable small-scale fisheries in the context of food security and poverty eradication. Quite a mouthful of a name. In short, we call them small-scale fisheries guidelines, in which all of the major challenges in a way are compiled in one document together with guidance on how to address them. And these guidelines are the result of a participatory development process. So they are really informed by the involvement of fishing communities from around the world, but also other stakeholders. And they have been agreed on and have been endorsed by the almost 200 members of the FAO. So we are now working with the countries, with the small-scale fishing communities around the world, with other partners, including Duke University, to help implement these small-scale fisheries guidelines.
Oh, this is really fascinating and it's important work. I'm intrigued in this participatory process. How are small scale fisher organizations involved in this? Are you working with different organizations or is this more individuals who are just interested in this issue coming to the fore?
This is through organizations at all levels, be it at the national level, where we are, for example, facilitating the formation of new women organizations in a number of African countries, be at the regional level, in particular in Africa. There are existing structures in the context of the African Union, which has established so-called non-state actor platforms for fisheries and aquaculture, which we are supporting in order to bring their voice into the processes and to facilitate peer learning. And then there's a number of global social movements and producer organizations for small-scale fisheries that we are working with and using them as a facilitator to involve as many as possible and gather as much insights that is coming from the membership of those organizations to then bring into global, regional, national processes from our side.
This is really important to hear at how different forms of governance and at different levels are playing a part in developing these guidelines. So thank you for sharing that, Nicole. I'd like to turn to you, John. You have more than 20 years of experience in studying and advising government policies to regulate human use of the oceans, with a particular focus on marine conservation practices. How has your thinking about marine conservation changed over the last 20 years?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it's changed a bit. As you mentioned, my interest in work has been on ocean conservation and how it can alleviate poverty. A lot of times that's meant managing fisheries to address poverty. And I think in the past that meant that I was really focused on what governments could do to increase the efficiency of fisheries, the economic efficiency. How do you increase incomes? How do you increase revenues for communities? All very important. But for all the reasons that Nicole mentioned, I spend a lot more time now thinking about the process rather than the outcomes and thinking about what institutions are in place, can be created to help empower small scale fishing communities to have much more of a voice in the decisions that affect them, in how the resources are used, how the space is using. I mean, Nicole outlined really well a lot of the challenges that are facing communities, from increased industrialization of ocean use to the squeeze from climate change and the effect on resources, and even the fact that the climate change may be driving people to the oceans. I mean, as farms and agricultures maybe fail or face challenges, oceans are often open access and can even be a sink for people to make a livelihood. And so, yet more pressures coming from outside these fisheries. How can fishers have a greater voice in making the decisions that impact them and safeguarding their livelihoods?
No, thank you for that. And I'm interested in understanding how do these fisher folks who are trying to organize and are organizing, how does that interact with sort of larger markets? I mean, I would imagine a number of these folks are catching fish and other seafood that goes into global markets. What's the interaction or challenges that may happen there?
Yeah, I mean, as Nicole mentioned, because small scale fisheries are so diverse, you have in many places, these may be located near an urban center where you can have easy access. You can get fresh fish in a cooler and put it on a plane and off it goes to an export market. And we found that, what maybe surprised us was a significant number of small scale fishers are exporting in some cases. So then that can be challenging because You might get higher prices, which is a good thing, but it might drive, for example, more fishing effort. It might drive higher levels of exploitation. It might change traditional practices, traditional rules for the fisheries, might really change how fishers organize in a given place. So the access to export markets, even in, say, an island setting, has kind of scrambled past fisheries management in some places and can be, an outside force.
Great, thank you.
John and Nicole, I want to ask you both a question now about painting a picture of these communities that you're working with. You both mentioned how diverse small scale fisheries can be. And I was wondering if you could just share what one community in particular looks like that you've worked with. What are the challenges that particular community faces, or alternatively, where do you see things actually working well? So, Nicole, could I ask you to respond first?
Yeah, Kerilyn, I'm working more with the global processes and the global level. So through that, I have the privilege of working with representatives from many, many communities. So maybe what I can share is the feedback that I'm getting through that in terms of the change that we can observe and that is affecting fishing communities around the world. So I think one thing that is being brought up as a concern by many is what I mentioned before. It's a process of aging in fishing communities and often a lack of capacity to retain young people in the sector. And that has different reasons. Now there are all of these challenges that small scale fisheries have to face and that are difficult to overcome. So that often drives in particular young men to leave the communities or within the communities to look for other alternative livelihoods, no, and not to take on the skills of fishermen or getting engaged in small scale fisheries more broadly. So in some cases, yeah, it's not only other activities within the community, but really leaving the community and leaving in some cases also the country. So what we see there is that sometimes people that have the skills, maybe still as a fisher, that have tried to fish, so they have a knowledge of fishing, they emigrate out into other countries. And in some cases, they are then hired into industrial fisheries where they work on industrial boats that go out fishing for longer periods of time, but where they at times end up in situations that can be called slave labor, basically, that are subject to serious violations of human rights. And that is, in a way, it is generated by this vulnerability or the poverty that is in those communities and the lack of being able to make a living, a decent work in the fishing community. So that is something that we have seen is happening. We have also seen that in some cases, there's an involvement of fishers into, say, more illegal activities, be it in drug trafficking, be it also into the trafficking of people. I'm thinking even about the Mediterranean. I'm working out of Italy, Rome now, so we have a lot of immigration from North African countries, for example, that's coming through that route, and oftentimes it happens that the transport of migrants is actually carried out by fishers and their boats because they have the skill to navigate the sea, and they make a better living by transporting illegal migrants than going fishing. So those are some of the challenges we hear. And the other one is in relation to what is now a concept that is getting more and more traction. It's often known as the blue economy, which is in a way looking at the ocean as a last frontier for economic development. And that includes, on one hand, the expansion of previously existing industries such as tourism, but also the expansion of newer sectors such as alternative energy production. Think wind parks, no, in coastal areas. So what happens here is that in many cases, this adds, again, additional pressure on the available maritime space in the water and on the land. The expansion of marine aquaculture is another example. So So that also is something that we hear is becoming an issue for small scale fishing communities to defend the space that they need to maintain their lifestyle.
John, is there anything you'd like to add on this question of how fisheries are changing?
Very, very briefly, I mean, just taking the example in West Africa where I've spent some time over the years. I mean, yes, you certainly have some communities there where it actually doesn't seem as if the fisheries are changing as much, in the sense it's quite static and stagnant. And this could be caused by a lot of the reasons that Nicole mentioned, but the community, the economy, the fisheries aren't growing. Young people may be leaving for a number of reasons, but it doesn't have to be that way either. I mean, there are examples. I was in Liberia last week, and there, from the numbers that the government has, small scale fishing communities are growing. The number of fishers are growing. They've actually made a conscious effort to protect a certain area of the ocean just for small scale fisheries, and to prohibit trawling, and to give the communities more space to grow and operate in the 20 years since the conflict ended there. So again, it doesn't have to be sort of stagnant or grinding on in some of these communities as they cope with competition for resources, for example, competition for space from others, where they were given that space. In some cases in Liberia, they've grown. That may have its own challenges. But
Um, Interesting. In the back of my mind, when thinking about these communities and aging and migration of younger generations away from these livelihoods, as someone who studies the relationship between migration and development, I think it's a common trend where, as countries develop, young people leave traditional economic activities, they get more educated, they move to cities, they move abroad. And so, to what degree is this somehow just part of these countries' development? Should we expect young people to be leaving them? And to what degree might we think differently about development in a way that would enable more young people to stay? And I think, John, you mentioned a really interesting point about how protecting the space for these small scale fisheries to operate is one thing that seems to have kept people engaged in this livelihood. I'd be curious if there's other things that come up for you, other ways of thinking about enhancing the capability to stay in small scale fishing livelihoods.
sure, and I'd be curious what Nicole's seeing from her perspective. I think to some extent it's a different question if the small scale fisheries are economically viable. And so what I think Nicole and I are referring to in many cases is where, for a lot of these external pressures upon them, they may not be as viable as they once were. And that has its own push on people. Whereas, where fishers are empowered, they have more of a voice in what happens to the fisheries, and controlling their space and the resources. It can be more economically viable in these fisheries. And that presents a different set of choices for young people there. And so that's where we've really focused is, okay, what is the process by which small scale fishing communities have their voices heard more, have much more of a say and much more power in the use of the fisheries, the use of the coastal areas, the things that affect those fisheries and their livelihoods. And then we can see what those choices might look like. But Nicole, I'm not sure if that's consistent with what you've seen in a number of places.
Yeah, maybe to also rebalance the bleak picture I painted before. There's obviously, like John said, there are obviously good examples. I think an important condition is probably linkage to markets. Like John said, no, the economic viability in many ways does play a role, and there are examples how that can happen in different ways. For example, in Morocco, the country has made quite a significant investment to build a whole series of ports for small scale fisheries, specifically along the entire coastline of Morocco, where they are providing a port that is not just a landing site for small scale fisheries, but it provides like a system of integrated services. There's an auction hall, so the fish comes in, it's immediately kind of weighted, they get the information, the label, what they've brought in. Then it goes into an auction that has set rules that everybody is tied to. But in that same area, for example, there's also a bank, or there is an office that helps with the access to social protection services, for example. So it's a whole integrated service center, and that really makes a difference to help make the sector more efficient, but at the same time also really keep the tradition. So it's not only economic efficiency, but by having all of these different centers, it allows to maintain many people employed and to maintain also the characteristics of each of those different lending sites. That's one example. I was in Korea last year, and there they were doing something similar. And they are reviving some of their traditional fishing villages, where they are also investing in those fishing communities and providing them with funding to set up, for example, restaurants that are run directly by those involved in the fishery. Those are in particular places that are close to cities. In my case, I was in Busan, so it's very closely connected to consumers now that come out there. They are focusing on certain products in these villages that they are famous for traditionally. They have little shops. They're starting e-commerce for some of the products. So the way they package and they label has become much, much wider than before. So again, that has revived a bit those communities. In Italy, it's a country that's famous for its food, and they are in the region that's called the Amalfi Coast. There's a tiny village, and it's famous for the production of a value-added product made from tiny sardines that are fished by the small-scale fisheries boats, and they are processed in a very particular way. And there is a label of geographic origin of this product, and it can only come from that village. And it has a high price. It's like a high-end product, so to say. And in a way, these are also approaches that provide dignity to this profession and a sense of pride, which is really important and should not be underestimated in also increasing the willingness, for example, of young people to be part of that and maintain the viability of the sector.
Yeah, sorry to just add, I think that's a really important point on the dignity and pride and the importance of these fisheries in so many places and cultures. I mean, I'll never forget talking to a minister of finance in one country and starting to try to make the economic case for supporting small scale fisheries, cut me off in about 30 seconds and started talking about growing up fishing in the village and going back home for vacations, and just the importance to the entire community of fishing to him, and just how much it was a part of the fabric of the culture.
I love that. That does seem so important and wonderful to hear those very specific examples that do give some hope. It's not just a bleak future.
It's great to hear how government policy is helping shape and reshape these fisheries in a way that allow for economic viability, and also these are opportunities to connect communities to these traditions. And so I find that really fascinating. I want to kind of push a little bit beyond that and bring back the idea of how to deal with climate that was mentioned earlier, and also change our focus from government policy to sort of what's happening within these small scale fisheries and fishery organizations. So, Nicole, a lot of your work focuses on building more inclusive policy processes and stakeholder engagement. And so, from your perspective, how does community led climate adaptation rather than top down adaptation agendas lead to different outcomes?
Well, I think one way that seems quite obvious how community led adaptation can lead to different outcomes is simply that in that case, the traditional and the indigenous knowledge that is within those communities will be considered much more strongly. And this is something that can be really critical to crafting solutions for that very site-specific context. Because the impact of the climate change can be very different in every region and every locality, due to that specific environment that it's encountering there. And holding the knowledge and being able to observe the changes and then adapt to them is something that certainly a community-based approach has an advantage over something that would be coming from a more centralized top-down, a little bit more one size fits all approach. And this can then imply little things like, for example, if the water temperature changes, we see in fisheries, we see a change in the fish behavior. No, we see how certain stocks start to move to different environments and others are coming in. So the communities obviously need to adapt to that, and they do that automatically. Now, if it changes, they adapt their gear, they adapt to the new species that is there. So in many cases, there are solutions that are already happening and adaptations that are already happening that may not carry that label, that name. But if you look at it, it is really what is happening, no? Or you can see in some cases that, for example, there are initiatives that are coming also spontaneously from the communities to replant mangrove forests, where you can observe that there is a rising seawater level that is threatening the communities and where they have their houses, where they have their daily lives. No? You can see that through NGOs, and often there is support projects for that, but you can also see it happening more spontaneously when communities observe that change. So the top-down approaches often they lack that more nuanced, site-specific considerations in their approaches and the consideration of that specific knowledge. On the other hand, it needs to be said though that the top-down approaches can also play an important role. For example, countries develop their national adaptation plans, and those plans are usually developed at the higher level, at the central level, and often fisheries and aquaculture are not necessarily included in those plans. So that is something where the top-down level can play a very important role and really make a difference for small-scale fisheries by ensuring that fisheries and aquaculture are included in a sector. So I guess that in the end, as always, it's not black and white. No, it's something that we need to take into account both of it and have any climate change adaptation approach to small-scale fisheries being grounded in both and have a way to bridge the top-down and the bottom-up approaches.
I really like this idea of bridging between the top-down and the bottom-up approaches, understanding the local knowledge that's there. I would imagine that's also knowledge that when used to make decisions makes it easier for people to stick with those decisions because it's a part of their voice. It's who they are. And then the other side, it's critical to make sure that those plans are a part of a larger national move, because if the government is not involved, if those higher level decision makers are not involved, they can easily overlook the needs of those communities. So I really appreciate hearing that. And I think sometimes we hear this tension. It needs to be one or the other. And you're making a really compelling point about how it has to be integrated. John, I'm really intrigued to see from your perspective, how do you see this top down versus bottom up approach working in the work you've done?
Well, I'll do what I typically do is echo and agree with Nicole, but just to give an example, I mean, she said it better than I, but just to give an example that I love, I teach this one in my class, is an old paper by Bob Johannes, a marine ecologist. And, the standard practice in managing fisheries is government scientists, you count the fish, you then set limits often from the top down. And his point was, in the case of Indonesia, if you look at the reef fisheries that go through most of the communities, one tool to assess the fish stocks is to do a visual census. You swim transects along the reefs and you count the fish. So he did a back of the envelope estimate and he said, well, if you were going to do that through all the reefs throughout Indonesia, it would probably be finished in about 400 years. And that would give you one snapshot. So he's like, you can't do this. You have to rely on the local knowledge in these communities. Right. I don't want to romanticize traditional knowledge too much, but I just can't imagine how policies would effectively support adaptation in these communities without building upon this traditional ecological knowledge.
John, since coming to Duke from the World Bank, you've regularly collaborated with non-academic partners like the FAO, as well as the UN Environmental Program. Can you tell us more about how your partnership with the FAO and your work with Nicole more specifically began?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think with anything, I got really lucky. But when I first came to Duke, I started working with a colleague, Professor Javier Basurto at the Marine Lab, who I think is one of the world's leading scholars on how communities come together to manage common resources like fish stocks. And so we organized a workshop at Duke on small scale fisheries. and got talking to Nicole, invited Nicole and some of her colleagues at FAO to that workshop together with others on thinking about a way forward for small scale fisheries for philanthropy. And I think from those conversations started to see the need to build the global evidence base on how important these fisheries are in society. And Nicole could probably say better, but from there, I think you and colleagues said, maybe you all could work with us. We're planning to do this study to build this evidence base, and maybe we could collaborate. And I think we're very fortunate that Duke gives the space for that kind of engaged research and allows us to do it. And I don't think we knew how long it would be when we started, Nicole,
No.
but over 5 years and 800 researchers later, we, Javier, Nicole, myself, and so many others, and concluded with this global study that we hope does have a little bit clearer picture on the role of these fisheries in society.
Nicole, from your side, what does an academic partner bring to the table? What's your motivation for partnering with someone like John or Duke University more specifically?
Well, I think as FAO, we like to call ourselves as a knowledge organization, but we ourselves, we're not an academic institution. We don't conduct research ourselves, no? So we need to partner around that. We work with the policymakers, though. So one of our roles, in a way, is to broker and improve that science policy interface. So this is why collaboration with academia research for us is very important. And what we experienced in this particular collaboration with Duke University to produce this study called Illuminating Hidden Harvest: The Contributions of Small-Scale Fisheries to Sustainable Development was really that first we realized we have a shared vision, shared objectives. And I think that's fundamental. No, you need to make sure that you have the same values, how you approach these things. And in this case, it aligned very well that we really wanted to take, in a way, a human-centered and multidimensional approach to look at small-scale fisheries. And then it was also very important to understand what every partner brings to the table, no? The different strengths that we have, and then based on that, define the roles and what everybody's doing in a project. And the added value for us was certainly the capacity from Duke University side to help develop the method that we developed for the country case studies that we conducted in 58 countries. And not only to develop that method, but then we had a postdoc at Duke University for this project who was actually then engaging with all of the people in these 58 countries. And she was coaching them in that methodology, actually in 3 languages, which was quite amazing. It was very, very thorough. We could not have done that. And we had a lot of other students from Duke University that helped us once we had the data gathered to then screen that data, harmonize that data, clean that data, obviously under the leadership of John, Javier, and other colleagues, no? So that was really something that was adding a lot of value, and actually also helped us to get to know a lot of the students from Duke, and some of those then ended up also becoming consultants working with us more broadly on small-scale fisheries. So that was certainly great value for FAO as collaboration.
Wonderful, thanks.
Thank you all so much for this conversation. It really helps us understand the complexity of small-scale fisheries and how these fisheries are addressing and adapting to climate change. And one of the things that was really important out of this conversation is how academic and non-academic or governments or intergovernmental organizations can collaborate. So I really appreciate the insights that you all have provided. I think this is a really good place to stop. So John and Nicole, thank you so much. Our guests today are Nicole Franz from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, or FAO, and John Virdin of Duke University's Nicholas Institute for Energy, Environment, and Sustainability. This podcast was co-sponsored by the Duke Program on Climate Resilience and Mobility. I'd like to thank my co-host, Kerilyn Schewel, who has been an excellent colleague in this whole process. I would also like to thank Deborah Hill, who is the producer of this podcast. And thank you to the listeners. If you would like to subscribe to the Leading Voices in Food podcast, you can get it on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast apps. Transcripts are also available on the website of the Duke World Food Policy Center. This is Norbert Wilson with Kerilyn Schewel. Thank you.